Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY. Next episode of Operation Bad Wolf. This stuff is coming along pretty quick. I don't think I'm going to have quite daily videos, but I'm going to have pretty frequent videos here for the next couple of days, I think. And that's because I have a lot of stuff I got to take off this thing. So without further ado, let's get back to work taking some stuff off of this motor. All right, so we are back in front of the motor here, and as you can see, I've got my valve cover off right now, and I think the next thing I want to do is start taking apart this rocker assembly, taking out the lifters, the thermostat housing, really just take apart the whole head and get it off. I'm really eager to see what the combustion chambers look like after this. The engine was running pretty good, but who knows, there might be something wrong in there. That's kind of the fun stuff that happens while you're taking apart all these things. You get to see if there's actually broken, messed up things in here. Now when you're taking the head off, it's really important that you loosen it in the opposite pattern that you tighten it from. So in this case, I'm going to take these rocker assembly bolts off all in order. Those don't actually hold the head on. But as far as all of the nuts on these studs, I want to make sure that I take them off in the correct order. That way nothing gets messed up, the head doesn't warp while I'm taking it off. It shouldn't really, it's cold and everything, but it's better safe than sorry. So let's do that.
The best piece of advice I have for someone trying to succeed in the film industry or any creative space is if you're doing what everyone else is doing, you're doing it wrong.
One of the best to ever do it.
All right, so now that we have the rocker assembly off, I am going to lift all of my lifters out, but I do something when I do this, and it's a piece of cardboard. I label which side is the radiator, which is effectively the front side of the motor, the technical front side of the motor, and then I label them 1 through 8, and then I take each lifter out and run it through my cardboard. And that helps me keep these in order. And generally speaking, it's for the best if you keep these in order so that they can go back into the car in order when it's time for reassembly. And so now I have my wind chime of lifters and I can set that aside. All right, next up, obviously we've got to lift the head off. And so there should be a little wiggle game. And one thing, on the back of some heads, this is not on every single cylinder head, there is a small hose that goes into your water pump. It's a bypass. So in my case, I haven't disconnected that, so I'm going to loosen that up, and that's going to let me lift my head off. At least it should help me lift my head off. Let's loosen both of these hose clamps just in case it wants to let go on the bottom or the top. We'll be ready for either. And there we have it. We have one cylinder head off, and now we can take a look at this gasket. I'm going to pull this off, and we'll do a close inspection of the face of the block, and then we'll head over to the head and take a look at the bottom of that and see how that's doing. There is quite a smell coming out of this. Now at first glance, you might see all of this oil and think, oh my gosh, this thing is totally leaking oil. It's leaking oil across the back and all that stuff. That's not necessarily the case. When you take your head off, there's a lot of oil that's stored up inside that head, as well as pressure between the lifter holes, which are these ones along the back, and the head itself. So you might lose a little oil like this. We can go ahead and clean that up. But one interesting thing that I'm seeing here when I'm looking down is that these holes right here are really, really gummed up. Like this one, which if I'm correct, these are all of your water channels, which is why they're kind of rusty as well. Yeah, I can kind of see the water sitting down in there. Those should definitely not be gummed up like this. This is a crazy amount of corrosion that's built up around this, which might explain why my motor was not running that great as far as temperature goes. You know, a lot can be said for having a proper amount of coolant running through your motor. So that's cleaned up. It actually wasn't too bad. While I was looking through those, it actually wasn't as bad as I thought it was. But nonetheless, things are actually looking pretty good. I don't see any blow-by on my cylinders. That means that the seal around the compression chamber was nice and clean. That was solid. While I'm looking at the color of the pistons themselves, let's move this camera a little farther forward. And if we take a look at the different colors that are on top of these pistons, it's surprisingly even between all of them. I mean, this one right here has a little bit more gunk built up on it. This one as well, right in the center, has some here. But overall, it's really not too bad. It's surprisingly good. I'm pretty satisfied with the way that looks right now. Let's move over to the cylinder head and take a look at that and see how that looks. All right, so now we're looking at the bottom side of the cylinder head, and this one is not looking great. I mean, this right here, the fact that it is so white means that this thing was running really, really lean. But as far as crossing over the different cylinders, I don't see any firing that's going in between the two of those. And then obviously the rest of this face looks pretty good. I mean, there's some corrosion around the water channels, which is kind of to be expected. But otherwise, I mean, it's in pretty good shape, all things considered. So I'm gonna clean this up a little bit. There's only so much cleaning I can do. I do think that I might bring this to the machine shop and just have them clean it. It's gonna make my life a little bit easier, and I'll probably bring the block in the cylinder head over to them and just have them give it a nice wash, nice clean. That way paint can go on it pretty easily. But otherwise, this is that bypass valve that I was talking about. You can see it pretty well here now. This goes down into your water pump. And then aside from that, it's just a regular cylinder head. Not much else to show you. So I'm gonna set this off to the side and let's move back over to the block and we can start taking apart the side with the timing chain and the timing cover. All right, so now on this side we have our water pump, our pulley, our timing cover. All this stuff has got to come off. And this bolt right here is usually easier to take off when the clutch is still in, or if you loosen it while the drive shafts are still assembled. As you guys know, I did not have the opportunity to do that in mine, but that's okay. I am going to try and loosen up this bolt. We'll see if the motor spins. Hopefully it won't, but it probably will. In which case we'll have to stick something in the flywheel, stick something in the teeth of the flywheel over on the other side to kind of hold it in place while I loosen this bolt. Should be pretty fun. Here we go. All right, so you didn't see, but I just knocked the pulley off of this. I've taken the 4 bolts out, and so that just pops off. But you also probably saw that I also took off the crank pulley, and the way that works is that you take this big bolt off, and like I said, I was hoping the engine wouldn't spin over, but it did. So what that meant is that I had to put the wrench on this side and take a flat punch, and I stuck it in the teeth of the flywheel. So you've got your flywheel like this, and I stuck the punch like this so that it kept it from spinning, and that would keep the motor from spinning over. And then I was able to loosen that bolt, and then I could slide that pulley off with just kind of a wiggle off of that. Now, it might not be that easy to get off for you guys. I think that I lucked out with that bolt. It was surprisingly loose, but sometimes that thing can be really on there, but thankfully it wasn't the case on mine. And then the pulley just comes right off. So the next thing that I want to do is take this timing cover off, as well as the water pump. So both of those are going to come off. The water pump's still spinning really nice. That's nice to see. And then we'll see what the stuff looks like over here. All right, now before we keep going, I want to stop a second because I've been kind of all over the place with this project and I haven't been super clear on everything I want to do to the motor. Because as you guys know, my motor was running, my motor was working pretty well. Aside from these drive shafts causing me some heartache, the motor was in pretty good shape overall. But as you can see, I've got the motor out right now, and that gives me the opportunity to change quite a few things and generally speaking, fix up some things that may or may not be exactly the way I want them. So the first thing, of course, what spawned the whole process was changing these U-bolt style drive shafts to something called a pot joint, and it's just a CV pot joint. Looks like this. It goes into your transmission, into your differential specifically, right here, like this, and then this end gets connected to your drive shaft. And this has the ability to pivot. It allows your drive shaft to move up and down like this and still get that rotational force you need to spin the wheels. These were held on by another clamp that looks identical to this that attaches to your drive shaft, and it clamps together with a small knuckle joint in there. Now this is an older style connection system. This is a newer style. This is something called a CV joint. And primarily it's what's used in newer cars, specifically front wheel drive cars. Some rear wheel drive cars still use a Hardy Spicer joint or a U-bolt style system. But overall, this is a more modern concept. Now, don't get me wrong, these still go bad. Nothing's totally perfect. But in the case of my motor, and the fact that it's out right now, this is going to give me the opportunity to change this out, as well as the differential inside this case. I have a single pin differential in there right now, and it's going to get switched to a 4-pin differential, which is considerably stronger, and overall is going to cause me less problems down the road and in the future. Now, that 4-pin diff is actually getting built up by a friend of mine called Paul Jeffries. And I'm super excited to share this with you. He is an awesome guy. He reached out to me and was more than willing to help me out with this project and worked through quite a few different things in addressing some upgrades and repairs to the system. He's also helping me out with some of the parts I need for the next step of the build, which is something that I wasn't going to do originally, but I have decided to switch to, and that's a rod change gearbox. Now, for those of you who don't know or who aren't familiar with what a rod change gearbox is, it changes this system right here on the back, which on my motor is called a remote shifter. And let's go ahead and grab that shifter and I'll show you guys what that looks like. Now, this is the remote shift housing. This obviously mounts up to the bottom right down here, and then you have your shifter that mounts here, and a rubber mount on the back that mounts to the tunnel that runs to the back of the car where your shift housing will actually sit. Now, most people, myself included, agree that this is a much stronger and more solid system. But one major difference on my car is that I have something called a sandwich plate that connects this to the bottom of my differential. The sandwich plate is something that was included on Austin Americas, or in the UK, the Austin Princess. In the Mini, the only version of this engine that came with a remote shift housing standard was the Cooper S, and it did not use the sandwich plate, and all the stuff down here, really just the bottom half right here where it connects to the shift housing, was much smaller. And because mine was so much bigger and made for a slightly larger car, it resulted in some collisions down underneath my car. Now, I've talked about this a lot in the last couple episodes, and I'm not going to bore you guys again with it, but the short story is that I want space down there. I don't want my motor to be kind of off-center anymore. I want it to fit properly. And most people will not have this issue, even if they have a remote shifts housing from an Austin America, because most likely the floor was welded in properly. In my case, my floor was not welded in properly. When I got this done back when I was in college, I got what I paid for, and it didn't quite turn out the way it needed to. So the result was this didn't quite fit the way it needed to. And it's been okay for these years, but it's time to change. And with the motor out again, doing the CV swap, I might as well just go ahead and switch the box from where the blue ends right here down. And I'll show you guys that in later episodes once I start getting that cleaned up. The next thing that I'm definitely going to tackle while the motor is out is putting in, again, a different camshaft. And I actually already have a mild road camshaft in this car that I'm going to swap out. I'm going to put a fast road cam in it, specifically the Evo 001 from Mini Spares. And the reason I'm going with that one is I've heard really, really wonderful reviews about it. It was inexpensive, and, well, actually, that's the two major reasons I'm going with it. And in order to do that, I did have to change my oil pump because it's for A+ only. But the reason it's for A+ only is that the oil pump is a slot drive, whereas mine's a spider drive. I won't get too far into that. It's not super important for this build. But the short of it is that I had to change the oil pump. But the next thing that we got to do, I think in my last clip I said I was going to go to this timing cover. I'm actually going to take the transfer case off. I do have a flywheel puller now that I borrowed from a friend. I'm sure you guys can figure out which friend that was. If you don't know, it's my friend Justin. But a mini flywheel puller is needed in order to pull the flywheel off of your crankshaft. All right, so I've done a video on pulling the flywheel, but I am gonna go through it in depth in this, but I do have another video. If you're interested in a video specifically on the flywheel, you can check it out. However, that said, I'm gonna be covering all the same details in this. Now, the first thing that you're gonna wanna do, if you haven't already, is take off the walk that's on the side of this. And keep in mind, this whole job can actually be done while the motor is in the car. It's really difficult to get to the bolts at the bottom of the walk, but it is possible. So let's undo these bolts and then start taking apart the flywheel. All right, so the first piece is off, and this is your clutch diaphragm. And this is the Pre-Verto clutch diaphragm. And you can see here, it's in pretty good shape. Nothing too wild going on in here. But what happens is when you actuate your clutch, this gets pressed in and is actually torquing these metal plates right here to actuate and engage and disengage your clutch. If you don't know how a clutch works, I did include a video in the top corner of this video, which should show you how a clutch works in more detail. There's not too much difference in the way that it works on a Mini as opposed to any other car. All right, so now we have the diaphragm off, those little clutch straps off as well. I'm not actually sure if that's what they're called, but that's what I'm gonna call them. And then the next thing we wanna do is start taking off this big old nut. Now, I can't remember what size this is. Hopefully I have a socket that's big enough. So the socket size that I use here is a 1.5 inch socket. It feels a little loose, but it seems to work pretty well for me. It's worked for me in the past. So if you have that size socket, you should be in pretty good shape. Now, I like to use a big old breaker bar for this because you're gonna need a lot of torque. And the other thing is, you'll see when I turn this, you can probably tell my motor's turning while I'm doing this, which is going to make it kind of hard for me to loosen that, as you can imagine. So the way I get around that is by putting a punch with a flat edge in the teeth of the flywheel while I torque this down, while I loosen this up, and that'll prevent the flywheel from spinning. It'll prevent the motor specifically from spinning over, and then you should be able to get that bolt out. Now, mine's come loose, which should be enough. Let's see if I can get it with just my hand here. Yeah. And so now I'll be able to unscrew that bolt. And this is necessary for you to get this flywheel off. Obviously, that bolt holds the flywheel itself on. And you'll notice the washer that's used for this is kind of special. It's got some bends in it, and it's meant specifically for this application. So if you chew up or mess up this washer while you're working on this, you're definitely going to want to pick up a new one. And there are links to these washers. Let's see if I can get that in focus. There are links to these washers in the description below should you need one of these. And the same can be said for the bolts if you need one of those. So if they're in good shape though, you can set it aside. Just make sure you don't lose it because those are not common bolts. Next thing you'll need to do is get this little washer off. If you don't take this washer off, you're not going to be able to get the flywheel off because the puller is going to be pulling while it's pushing that washer down and keeping the flywheel on. So make sure that you get this off, and it may be kind of hard to get off. So just fair warning, if it is, you can use some pry bars, you can use all sorts of stuff to get it off. Just find what works for you and get it off of there. So now we have a clean face to get the flywheel off. Now this part is one of those things that many people dread doing. And that's because, frankly, it's difficult. So let me set this up, and then I'll explain to you guys why it's difficult and what we're about to do. All right, so now you can see I've got my flywheel puller mounted up, and I'm gonna take my phone out and show you guys this in a little bit more detail so you can get an idea of how it works. All right, so it's pretty simple, but you have one main bolt in the middle that sits down on this retaining ring that is then in turn sitting on your crankshaft. And keep in mind this outer ring right here is not your crankshaft, that's the actual flywheel. The crankshaft is the shaft that's in the middle of this. Then you have your 3 bolts which hold this platform and this bolt steady. Now, a lot of people get tied up with, okay, I've got so much pressure on this thing and it's not coming off. And nine times out of 10, the reason that is because these bolts are ever so slightly different in their elevation off of the flywheel. And what I mean to say is it's creating, so say this is your flywheel and this is the plate. The plate might be slightly askew one way or the other, and it's not providing even pull on that flywheel. A lot of people are saying, oh, it took 6 months or 3 months for me to even get my flywheel off. And granted, it can take some time. It can take a few days. It can take a few sprays of penetrant, all sorts of different stuff to get the flywheel off. If it's taking 6 months, in my opinion, you're doing something wrong. But with that said, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna slowly adjust this, tighten these down, loosen them up until I can get this to be evenly spaced in between the flywheel and the plate, and then we'll just start torquing this down and try and getting it off. Now, if I'm lucky, this thing's gonna pop off. It's not gonna have any problems because it hasn't really been on there that long. It's only been on there a year since the last time that I pulled this off and did a motor rebuild. So hopefully we'll give this slow, steady pressure and we'll tighten it down and hopefully it'll come loose pretty easily. One more thing to keep in mind is that you don't wanna go ham on this thing really quickly. You can very easily break the bolt or break any of these studs on the sides. So just take your time. It's gonna be slow, steady, and like the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race in this scenario. One other thing before I start tightening this down is a fair warning. Sometimes when this flywheel comes off, it will pop off like a gunshot. So be prepared, it might startle you, but don't worry, it's not gonna explode or anything. I mean, it might pop off, but it's not exploding when it's doing that. But anyway, let's tighten this down and see if we can get it off. You saw one thing that I actually made a mistake and forgot to mention is that while you're tightening this, the flywheel is going to want to spin. So the way you can fix that is one, by putting, again, a small punch in that corner there to catch it and prevent it from spinning. Now, because it is making me a little tense, I'm going to put some ear protection on just so I don't scare the bejesus out of myself. All right, so there we have it. That actually came off way easier than just about every other time I've ever done this. So I'm pretty damn thankful for that. Like straight up, that was the easiest this job has ever been. Let's go ahead and slide it the rest of the way off. Now keep in mind your flywheel's heavy. So as you're sliding this off, once it reaches the end of that shaft, it's gonna fall. So you'll wanna be sure that you're here to catch it. Oh, there we go. Flywheel is off. This thing is heavy. We can set that to the side. And now we have a nice good look at our clutch in here too. So on a Pre-Verto clutch, you have this big steel diaphragm that goes behind it, which actually makes life kind of hard when you're putting it all together. But when we look at this clutch disc, things are actually looking in pretty good shape here. Not seeing any major issues with it. It's got a lot of meat left. I might consider replacing this, but I'm probably not going to. It's in good shape. So I'm going to set that aside and we'll pull the pressure plate out as well. This is another heavy piece. We can set that off to the side. And now we've got a really nice clean look at the inside of our walk and the front side of the transfer case. Now you have right here your primary gear, which is held on by a retaining clip like this, right off the side of your crank. I'm going to leave that on there for right now. This orange bit is your rear main seal. Now, you might be wondering, why is it called the rear main seal? And that's because this side of the motor is technically the back side of the motor. And the reason it's the back side of the motor is this A-series motor actually went in line in configurations in other cars, and then you'd have the transfer case and transmission all off the back of your car. Now, in the Mini, with the engine mounted transversely, the primary reason that the transfer case sat on the side like this, and then you had the transmission underneath, was so that you could fit it into a smaller space. So you have all this gearing underneath this primary gear that runs down to your transmission, which we'll see here shortly. And the primary job of that other gearing is to deliver the power to the bottom and then out the drive shafts that are back here. So, next step, we're going to take out all these bolts. Now notice there is a retaining clip on all of these. You're just going to want to make sure that that doesn't get gummed up, chewed up, and we'll take all of these off and store them in a baggie off to the side.
What's the secret to happiness? The secret to happiness is finding something you love and then doing that for the rest of your life.
And there we have it, a transfer case off. Set that down here so it can drain with the rest of the oil. And now we are looking at the main drop gear system on this Mini. Now, one, you have your oil pump here. Two, like I said before, this is your primary gear, and that is what turns all of the other gears, and as you can see, turns the drive shaft as well. Then you have your idler gear, and then you have your drop gear. Now, I'm 90% certain that I got all those correct, but if I didn't, please tell me in the comment section. You know, I love feedback from you guys. But anyways, we can start taking off these gears and setting them aside. Most of these gears are going to be leaving and getting replaced with new gears. And there are some special considerations that you got to take into account with this primary gear when you're switching to a rod change system, or specifically from an A series block to an A plus series block. There are some special considerations which I'll dive into as we get to those things on this car. Now it's pretty simple. You take the retaining ring off, you slide this off, which is another retaining clip. I am going to keep these because it's made specifically for my crankshaft and the crankshaft that went in this A series motor. Your primary gear will come right off. Now keep in mind that if you have a 1275, these primary gears are getting hard to come by, especially in the United States, let me tell you. And this is something that you're going to want to hold on to. You've got a bushing that's on the back, don't lose that. And you can set that off to the side. Do the same thing for your idler gear. And then this gear, you'll find, doesn't actually come off. And that's okay. We don't need it to come off. We can leave that on there, and we'll be able to take that piece off with the rest of the transmission. We're pretty much done with this side of the motor. As you can see, it's still draining quite a bit of oil down here, which is to be expected. There was a lot of oil in there. It was a running motor. But the only thing that I have left to do probably in this episode is run over to the other side and take off the timing cover and the timing plate. That's just gonna help me dismount the gearbox and make sure all those seals don't interfere with me being able to pull the gearbox off. Now this side is considerably less complicated than the other side that we just pulled off. I've already showed you I've taken off the pulley for this, but you're also gonna have to take out all these bolts that are surrounding your plate here, and that's gonna allow you to get the cover itself off. Then we're gonna see our timing gears, and we're gonna be able to take off the bolts inside that are holding on this actual plate. It's pretty straightforward, but let's go ahead and run those bolts off, and then I'll show you the insides. All right, so I am finding out some kind of interesting stuff about my motor. I didn't realize, one, that I was using a silicone gasket there, and then two, more importantly, I didn't realize that I had a duplex chain on this already. What you can see here is that this duplex chain adds additional strength into your chain drive system inside your timing cover. And you can see that with two sets of teeth on each gear, and then two chains, you get a lot of tension, you get a lot of strength in that. But as you can also see, that's a lot of play in that chain. And that is not ideal. So that's something that we're gonna have to address for sure. But anyways, let's go ahead and take this timing gear system off, and we can set that aside. I'm gonna pull this nut off, and then both of these, all this should slide off pretty easily. We shall see. All right, and there we have it. We have a free camshaft. We should be able to pull that out relatively easy, as well as a free crankshaft. This whole gasket surface is now decoupled, and nothing's holding it on except for the bolts on the gearbox itself. So I think that's a pretty good place to cap it off for this episode. So real quick, let's clean up and then we'll finish off the episode. Alright, so sorry for the camera and the audio. At the end of filming this episode, my camera died and I really want to get this filmed and done so I can edit it tonight. But I think that we did an amazing job today. We got a ton of stuff done. We got the transfer case off, the clutch off, the flywheel, the timing cover. I mean, we got basically everything on the outside of the motor off so that we can get the gearbox off, which is going to be the next kind of hardest thing to do. And honestly, it's really not that hard to do. But nonetheless, we got to do it. So that's it for this episode of Operation Bad Wolf. There are a lot more to come, and for that matter, there's going to be a lot more in the next coming weeks. You know, I've got a ton of stuff to do on this thing, and I really don't want to leave anything out for you guys. So as always, a big thank you to 7 Mini Parts for sponsoring this channel and for providing all the parts that I use on these episodes. If you guys need any of the parts that I used in this episode, head over to the description. I've got links to all of those. It'll send you to their site, and they'll know that they're getting traffic from my YouTube channel, which helps both of us out quite a lot. But on the next episode of Operation Bad Wolf, we're going to be taking off the gearbox, and we're also going to be stripping paint, I think, off of the block and the transmission housing, cleaning up the new transmission, which I'll show you guys in more detail at that point, and some differences between the rod change and the remote gearbox. So stay tuned for that stuff. But until then, I'm just gonna have to have a messy shop full of engine car parts and lots of stuff to do. But until the next episode, until I see you guys again, enjoy those minis and motor on.